Probal, thank you for joining us. So for our viewers, you are a former infantry officer. You have served with the Gorka Regiment, and now you're a military historian. You have recently written a book detailing a very little-known conflict between India and China 5 years after the humiliating defeat of 1962. It's a skirmishes that took place in 1967 that not many people know about. And having been a person who served in the armed forces and has had a chance to look back at events unfolding in an academic manner, in a more analytical manner, we thought it would be a great time, given the circumstances that are unfolding both in along the LAC as well as in New Delhi and in Beijing. We thought it would be good to have your perspective on the ongoing issues. So let me begin. First, for those who do not know much about 1967, which has been highlighted in your book, The Watershed, can you tell us a bit about what happened 5 years after 1962 and why it is very important and why we should know more about it?
Okay. Thank you, Jaskirat, for having me on the show. I really appreciate it. I think this is a great time to talk about 1967, given what's going on. So to your point, your question, 1967 happened 5 years after the setback that India received in the 1962 war. Why is it important? Because the reference about China that dominates, the narrative that used to dominate in India was primarily the 1962 setback. And that's why it's important to understand how after 1962, within 5 years, there are a lot of changes that happened insofar as the political leadership is concerned, the military leadership was concerned. And just to take a step back, the changes occurred around 64, 65 when India started beefing up its military divisions and its armament, equipment, etc. And then the war with Pakistan happened. This is important to understand because China actually sided with Pakistan, and there was a secret treaty to take Sikkim and Kashmir and barter them. So that was in place insofar as the 1965 war is concerned. What gave India confidence there was that India actually ended the war on a high note as far as Pakistan is concerned and thwarted China's attempts to push India back insofar in Sikkim. But the Sikkim part festered, and in 1967, by 1967, India-China relations had really hit the nadir, and Indian diplomats were arrested in Beijing. India had inflicted a quid pro quo in Delhi on Chinese diplomats. All of that had happened, which finally culminated in two battles in Nathula and Chola. Now, between 62 and 67, the Chinese strategy was to psychologically dominate India along the border. There were several skirmishes. There were ambushes where Indian soldiers were killed. There was consistent, intermittent instances of firing along the border in that period. China had also tested its nuclear, had become a nuclear power in 1964. So all of that had happened. So the psychological dominance of China was, that was something that the Chinese believed they had an ascendancy over India about. So 67, when 1967 happened, this was a shock for China. Because if you look at the period between 62 and 67, there were several skirmishes that happened. India had suffered losses. There were firing from across the border. So 1967 at Nathula, when the Chinese, over an argument over a fence, launched fire, and India had responded and finally triumphed over China. That was something that the Chinese had never expected. 15 days later, and I wouldn't go into the details of it, but just the importance of it, 15 days later, because the Chinese believed that this was something that was a flash in the pan. That was not possible. So within 15 days, when they launched another attack at Chola, the Gorka Regiment, they valiantly fought against the Chinese, and in Chola, they were again given a bloody nose. So within a month, there were two battles in which China had suffered humiliation and losses. Why is that important? Is because 2 years later, against the Russians, against the Soviets that time, the Chinese again had a similar kind of an approach where they tried to provoke them along the river Ussuri. And there too, they had suffered a heavy defeat. What that meant to the Chinese morale was that by 1971, when Pakistan and India went to war on the Eastern Front, there was every reason for China to interfere because it was closer to their borders, and they could have cut India off at the Siliguri corridor, which is a narrow neck of 25 kilometers width, which really stretches out like a paste of toothpaste tube. So China didn't do that. And if you compare 65 and 71, 1965, they interfered in the India-Pakistan war. But in 1971, they did not. And that set the narrative for the future course of history to follow.
Now what we're looking at over here, the face-off along the LSE, especially the Galwan River and the Galwan Post, which has already seen action about 50 years ago, 70 years ago. How are things different right now? Do you feel, of course, both the nations have moved a long way since 1967. Do you feel like the Chinese are still smarting, or they have that confidence of being that global power where they can be a little pushy? Or do you feel there is a definite, genuine difference of perception which may just get sorted out in talks and not culminate in clashes like 67 or 62?
Yes, I think I'll answer your question in two parts. I think we've moved a long way from 1967. If we go back in history, this current India, not the standoff, but the relations are also governed by the protocols that have been put in place in the mid-2000s. And then, we also had the 1993 treaty between India and China. And before that, you had another standoff in Somdurungchu in 1986. But all of this goes back to that point of 1967 when it stopped. The kind of confrontation that existed between India and China at that point of time was very different from what it is now. Then it was a direct confrontation. It was a communist government of Mao Zedong who wanted to establish a regional dominance at that point of time. A lot of, like you rightly said, Jaskirat, a lot of time has flowed, and a lot of events have happened in the interim. Soviet Union has collapsed. China has become a global power. So their interests, their aims have changed. Regional dominance certainly remains one of their priorities, and that's why the conflict with India. But the nature of it, which was a direct confrontation with India in the 1960s with no mechanism to really resolve that conflict, that has changed, and we have mechanisms in place. But the Chinese ambitions, overvaulting ambitions, kind of put them in direct odds with India's ambitions. Because now the conflict is a more surrogate conflict. And that's why you see Nepal coming in. That's why you see Maldives coming in. And that's why you see the Hambantota port in Sri Lanka. So it's a surrogate, more sophisticated conflict. If I may take you to the kind of conflict that we used to see between Soviet Union and the US at a global level, now I would think that this is a time where we are witnessing a similar kind of a conflict at a regional Asian level between India and China, which is surrogate in nature, using other smaller nations to embarrass the other, or influencing governments around. I think that is what is going to stay. The direct confrontation, there are mechanisms to resolve it, and that's where we are in terms of we heard some of the reconciliatory noises of late. So I think that is the difference between 60s and now. China never acts without thinking. So if you look at, and this is where I would be a little nuanced about how Chinese have responded to, whether it's Taiwan or Australia or India, South China Sea, they have picked their battles. They've picked their battles based on old disputes and have moved from January. In January, they brought up the Kashmir issue in the UN in the middle of a coronavirus at home. So they knew that this is going to be really rebounding badly on them at some point of time. The pressure is going to be building up on them. So they moved proactively. They moved the UN, and they just didn't, it was not just the Kashmir issue, but they also spoke about Aksai Chin, about Ladakh. And that is precisely where we are at this point as we speak. And this, I'm talking about January when they raised it in the UN. Subsequently, the coronavirus, the pandemic became global noise. China was under the hammer. But if you go back in February, they started to make the moves in the South China Sea. So they have picked their battles early on so that they know who are going to be part of a global alliance post-COVID. India is going to be at the, playing an important role at the WHO as far as actions against China is concerned. There's Philippines, there is Vietnam, there is Australia with trade. So, if you look at each one of them, taking on Australia on trade, taking on the Vietnam and the others in the South China Sea over older disputes, would take on Japan because they've moved their businesses out. With India, because of their interconnected markets, they felt that the best way to really take on India was along the LAC. And again, going back to an older dispute. And I go back to Ladakh in January when they started preparing for that. That has been the response. One of the things that had happened in terms of the timing, why now, is also because from 22nd May, they had the CPC session in China, with a Communist Party session in China, where they also issued a very interesting statement. They used to always say, talk about peaceful reunification with Taiwan. In this session, they've taken out the word peaceful. They talk about reunification with Taiwan. Now, look at the kind of aggressive stance that they are taking about various things. Xi Jinping spoke about the military preparedness. Some people connected it with India because of the current, goings on at the border. But he spoke of it in the larger sense as well. And he issued a statement why China needs to be battle prepared. The Taiwan statement, the Hong Kong goings on. So there's been a pressure, and there's also a line passed this session asking the Chinese government to be more assertive with countries outside who are likely to form an alliance, and this is something that they had passed at the session. Now, given that they had the way they wanted to respond to India was not only along the LAC, but if you look at it, they've also used Nepal to take on India. Of course, Nepal has also backed down. It's a coincidence that even Nepal has backed down at the same time that China has been backing down. So there are certain things that kind of tell us how the smaller nations were used to act on their behest.
Why is it that despite all the tiffs that we've had with China since 62 and 67, it has largely remained a bloodless conflict along the border? We've had, bloodless in the sense that there's not been a shot fired, as is famously said. Right. What is the kind of mechanism and what is the effort that probably went into putting in place this mechanism? And do you feel like the outcome of the current TIF is also going to be sorted out as a result of this mechanism that has been put in place over the past few decades?
Right. Yes, I think what happened in 67, and before I answer your question, one of the things that I want to put on record is there were shots fired in 1975 when the casualties happened. 4 Indian soldiers died in an ambush. So for the statistically minded who sometimes remind you that, yes, there were shots fired, but that was an outlier that had happened. So I always say that from 67, barring one instance, no shots have been fired, no hostilities have occurred between the two nations. Now, what are the mechanisms? So what happened after 67? There were no mechanisms put in place immediately after that. What happened was 20 years later, the incident at Somdurungchu happened, where again Chinese infiltration and occupation of certain posts along the LAC prompted General Sundarji to use the 1967 template. And what was that template? Surprise and speed. Very simple elements, but to use them in terms of crisis and on the battlegrounds is a hallmark of a great general, which was General Sagat Singh in 1967, and he had used the artillery against the Chinese, though the orders for using the artillery had to come from Delhi, but he had used it himself, given the fact that otherwise the Chinese would have had the better of India at that point of time where the battle was going. 87, General Sundarji used an entire brigade, heli-lifted an entire brigade, which was the first time it had been done ever, and certainly surprised the Chinese, surrounded them, and made the Chinese go back a few kilometers. So after that, and if you look at the history, after that, it was a long-drawn peace accord where Rajiv Gandhi, the then Prime Minister, went to China, and Deng Xiaoping and Rajiv Gandhi had signed in court. So that kind of set into motion the peaceful transition that they were looking at, the two countries. 1993, they signed an accord. Then Mr. Atal Bihari Vajpayee, when he was the prime minister, he had opened up the trade between India and China at Nathula. So I think that again changed a lot of the narrative. Protocols were put in place in the mid 2000s. Interestingly, and this is something that I want to bring out, that after the protocols have been put into place in the mid 2000s, more standoffs have occurred than they had occurred before the protocols had been put into place. Now, what does that tell us? That also tells us that, to your question, will we go into another conflict? It tells us that representatives of both countries at the foreign ministry levels, they are aware of the levers that you have to pull things back from the edge, and that's also something that has enabled both countries to really resolve issues, whether it was Doklam or in the standoffs before that. So these mechanisms have helped. These mechanisms have helped over the years develop a kind of counter crisis response, so that you don't go over the edge as it happened in the 60s. And today there are higher political and economic stakes for both countries. If at all, to your question, if at all there was to be any sort of a conflict, it would, and this is at its worst, though I don't expect that to happen. That would be at a very local level. But even now, as we speak, I believe there are connects at the brigadier and major general levels on both countries in several places. So local military commanders continue to be in touch of both countries, and that's something that has also helped things from going over the edge.
Thank you so much, Probal. And I think it's essential, based on this conversation, that one must catch up with history to understand the context of the current events and not look at them in isolation, because that can draw the pattern for one's understanding. Thank you so much for sharing your insights and learning with us. Thank you for joining the Quint, and of course, congratulations on your book. We believe it's been doing very well, and it's the kind of stories that really do need to be told. Thank you, Probal.
Thank you, Jaskirat. It's been a pleasure being on your show. Thank you.